Hey, all right. Welcome to this today's version and edition of Guerrilla Discipleship. I get to be, my name's Kevin Baker. I get to be the host with you. And I have the great privilege today of talking to Barbara Lucas. She's a pastor in Texas. I'm going to ask her to introduce herself to you in just a second. But again, if you're new to Guerrilla Discipleship, it's our way of saying that God's inspiring and inviting all of us, not just the institutional church, but all of us as followers of Jesus to get into the game with God and to be used of God. And so I'm so glad that you joined us. So Barbara, would you take just a minute and introduce yourself to us, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we met.
Excellent. Barbara Lucas, and I am in Central Texas. I'm in McLennan County, and I am in the process of ordination towards the United Methodist Church at this time. And I'm a fairly new pastor as well, but I have a background with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship from when I was in college, and was involved actually with prayer and discipleship as the part of the leadership team with that. And so I think that the whole idea of discipleship and learning about discipleship has been kind of a black box for me that I couldn't understand and had no idea how to implement. And so I was really frustrated with discipleship in my church and in myself. And I think it was just the right time for the training that we did on discipleship.
Wow, Barbara, thank you. So, and what's the name of your church? I want everybody to know the church that you're pastoring.
Sure, it's Bosqueville United Methodist Church. It's a turn of the century, like 1888, old historic church with a beautiful grounds, a prayer garden. I fell in love with the grounds before I fell in love with the church. So
that's awesome. And if you all have been following the news lately, we're talking just after all of that horrible weather that Texas has been through. And Barbara, actually, I think you said that the pipes under your house burst in the midst of that. So you were without water for a while, but she's all fixed up today. So yeah. Here's how Barbara and I met. And it's kind of a weird story. I got a phone call from let's see, I think it was the dean of she's the dean of the cabinet, I think. Is that right? Is she the dean? Is Leah the dean of the cabinet?
Oh, she's our district superintendent for Central Texas. Mm-hmm.
Because of some other other organizations we're a part of. And so the district superintendent that's over Barbara's area in the United Methodist Church there in Texas called me, and we started working on something. And then she actually wanted to introduce me to the bishop there in that area. And we had about a 3-hour conversation, Bishop Lowry and Leah and I. And in the middle of that, he was asking some questions about how we were doing discipleship. And I told him about the disciple-making movement training. And he said he would like to have some of his pastors go through it. Now, I don't know what went on behind the scenes, but the next thing I know, there were about 30 or so of you guys that pastors that signed on. The bishop came in and out a little bit, but that's how we met Barbara. Was my wife and I, Michelle and I, were doing the training of the 7 elements. It's an 8-week training of disciple-making movements. And Barbara was a part of that. And it's not an exaggeration to say Barbara was the star student in many ways in that, and continues to be the star. She was just, has been and continues to be amazing. In fact, she's at that place where she's surpassed the person who did the training. But the reality is, as you know, we've got these different elements that we're trying to raise up. And one of the elements in disciple-making movements is to cast vision to other believers. I think that there are a lot of folks, Barbara, like you and me as well, who would say they've never really been discipled. They know the concept of discipleship in some way, but they don't, because they don't know a process or they don't know what it looks like, and nobody's ever taken them through it. They're kind of stuck. I think I liked your word. It's a black box. It's like, I want to know more about this, but I can't seem to unwrap it or unpackage it. And so one of the things that we want to do as we see a movement of disciple making happen is to help other believers. We want to go out among lost people and help them to know how much God loves them, but we want to get with other believers and say, have you seen this vision? So you cast a vision to them. Well, that's what we did as part of the training. And Barbara, oh my goodness, has just been amazing. It's a divine appointment to me, and no short thing. But let me ask you a couple questions, Barbara. So here you're already pastoring a church. You've been a Christian for a long time. You certainly had exposure to Christian ministries while you were in college. And we start casting a vision of disciple making. What was it like to get that vision in a way? I mean, how did that work? Did you go, oh, this is what I've always heard? Was it ruffling feathers for you at first? Or how did it even work to you to even hear some of the disciple making that we were talking about in the training?
I think what was most exciting to me was that it was practical, and that it's something that had fruit that was clear from other parts of the world, that it wasn't some kind of theoretical something that when we finished the 8 weeks, we were going to, put that book on the shelf and move on. It was something that God was using to transform the world, and for me to actually make the Great Commission a possibility. Because I had always read that from Matthew 28, and I had said to myself, why would God give us something that's impossible to do?
Yeah.
And so this was the first time. I think the most critical moment of the training for me, and I'm probably going to get a little emotional, was when you talked about what if we could reach 1% of the people for God's glory. And I remember so clearly putting in the chat, 1% is too small for God's glory. And it was just, I was overwhelmed, because that for me has been a driving factor, is wanting God's glory to be multiplied. And that's such a central part of the DMM training that it just keeps renewing my vision.
That's so awesome.
Absolutely.
Barbara, let me ask you a question out of that, because one of the things that, maybe you can speak to this from any angle you want, as a pastor now, as a person who's been, a follower of Jesus for a while. In the West, anyway, in the States, I think we've looked at the Matthew 28 passage, that Great Commission, where Jesus says to these 11 very unschooled, ordinary people, go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations. And I think we've sort of interpreted that. Maybe it's me. We've interpreted all nations as people from every nation. But it wasn't that, I think part of the disciple making movement training for me was like, God wants all people. He doesn't want just a few people out of every tribe at every time. He really loves all people and wants everyone to know him, and wants everyone. And why do we keep setting our sights so low? Why do we think, most churches, for instance, in their own desires for the next year, if they're visioning, they're thinking, gosh, if we could just get another 10 people to come, or depending on the size of their church, another 100, if we could grow by 10%. But in the disciple making movement, we're talking about, how do we reach whole neighborhoods, whole people groups, whole cities, states. In fact, your vision, and I'll ask you about that later. You have an end vision that you developed that is unbelievably big. I don't know if you've shared that with your church yet. They probably have fainted if you've shared it with them. But tell me a little bit about that. As a follower of Jesus, before we did the training, were you thinking, I want to see everyone, but I want to see, were you thinking as big as you do now, or were you thinking differently? Does my question make sense to you?
I think so. I think I'd answer that by saying that before I went through the discipleship making training, my perspective on everything that I did in the church, and there was joy in that, and faithfulness, I believe. But my perspective on everything was that it was all about addition. It was all about what I could do to make it happen. And through the discipleship training, and actually this isn't something that we covered, but it was just something the Lord brought to my mind, is I was studying Genesis 1, and from the beginning, it's always been about multiplication.
Yeah.
For things to reproduce after their kind.
Yeah.
And so from the very beginning, God intended us to be about multiplying, not about addition. in
Now,
every way. In
I
every
think
way.
I think you can see why Barbara is just an amazing person. I mean, you're right, Barbara. God says right there in the beginning at the creation of the world, be fruitful and multiply. There is something about God that wants to see, I think, expansion and blessing. And maybe it goes into just the generosity of who God is. He wants all people to be blessed. So part of this casting of vision, if I'm hearing you right, and I just want to see if I'm check this with you, is part of the vision casting that way that it affected you was to give feet to something that you had been dreaming about, that you wanted to see happen. And you knew, it seems like you're saying that you knew immediately, hey, I think I've been thinking addition and God's multiplication, and I want to figure out how to get to multiplication. Am I hearing you right on that?
Absolutely.
Now, have you cast that vision to your church? Have you talked about multiplication with your church some?
I would say not a lot. I think that I've talked about various elements of disciple making, but I really felt like I wanted to have some key influencers and leaders go through the training before I began to cast vision. So I cast vision individually, but it mainly was my own story. So that my casting vision came out of my own level of frustration. So I've had more success with casting vision with other pastors and other leaders than I have with my own congregation at this point. One big disappointment to me was that I had, in this last training that I just am completing in a couple of weeks, I had 5 of my who I felt were key people and influencers in the training, and one by one they dropped out after 2 or 3 weeks. And so one of the things, as I kind of brought that back to the Lord and was concerned about it, he basically just told me, you didn't pray. They got pulled by various distractions and things. It's kind of like the seed. You hope for the seed on the fertile ground, but I think you can pray. If you look at it, it's like 25% of the seed is sticks, right? The other 3/4 of them, either they're, it's snatched away, there's weeds, or it's rocky, right?
Yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of praying now before the next class starts. Like, I've asked people to submit to me the names of the folks that they're thinking about inviting. And I'm going to commit to pray for those folks, that they be fertile ground before we even begin a training, because I think that's why I lost my folks, so.
That's really helpful. Actually, Barbara, that just reminds me that I'm going to put on my calendar to talk with you again about how to transition an existing legacy church, which is what you're just talking about. And you've got a strategy there that you're using. So we need to talk about that too, because there are other pastors listening that are trying to figure out, how do I help my church get this? But you said something I want to key in on that I have experienced too. And that is, you said you were frustrated. I believe that God often uses frustration to get us moving forward. And at the church that I'm serving, I think we as a staff were wholly frustrated with our efforts at making disciples. We realized we had a lot of programs, we had a lot of activities, we had a lot of people. And the analogy that we used, and I may have shared this before, but the analogy we used was, if we were like some kind of a factory, like a Coca-Cola bottling factory. And, we've got these people coming in, and we hope that if they stay with us for a while, they'll actually be full of Coke, full of the Holy Spirit as they leave out. We noticed that we had a lot of bottles coming in, and, maybe 10% at best were going out. And if I were running a factory like that, you would be wasting, you couldn't survive. And so we started as a staff and as a board and the leadership here in the church to say, what are we doing? And we didn't want one more program, because we had tried programs. There's always a program. I didn't feel like when we got exposed to the disciple making training, it didn't feel like a program to me. It felt like a paradigm shift. It felt like, holy mackerel, this is something way different. And it really means that we have to do church very differently than we've ever done it before in order to become a church that's really making disciples in the way that this training. Have you experienced that, at least that paradigm shift? Would you say was it a paradigm shift for you?
What do you mean? Just one? How about every week there was a different one? I just had one last week. This is my second time going through the training. I went through a training again myself with Tyler.
Right.
While I was doing a training. So I was going through a training like a week before we actually did the training on that particular item. And I just had a major aha hit me yesterday.
Well, share it. I want to know what that was.
So two things actually happened yesterday. So we were talking about what if persons of peace, when you encounter them, were they all good people? Were they good people or bad people? We were looking at the various scriptures of these people that were catalysts of bringing the gospel to their influential people the people that they were influencing. And one of the ahas that hit me was that, first of all, there were times when the person of peace actually ministered to the person, the disciple maker that came to them.
Yeah.
Which I had never seen before. So I was thinking about the jailer feeding and attending to the wounds of Paul and Silas, which required them to accept it and be vulnerable and those kinds of things. And so that was kind of a paradigm shift for me to say that I need to be able to receive from the persons of peace as well. This is a mutual thing. They're not a project. They're a person that God's placed in my sphere, right? Yeah. So that was a kind of a major thing to me. And then to see that, again, just being reminded that that God uses miraculous things to sometimes turn a whole family or turn a whole group of people, like the woman at the well, with Jesus having an insight into her life. Yeah. She goes and said, "Come see the guy who's told me everything I've ever done." And then later, they say, "Well, we used to believe because you told us that, but now we believe on our own." Yeah. But it was that word of knowledge that Jesus was given about that woman that transitioned and turned that whole city. And I always think about fruit being one-on-one. I don't think about, it encouraged me paradigm wise to start praying for groups of people to come to Jesus.
Oh yeah. Awesome.
So
there's multiplication. Well, just interesting that you say the thing that you're talking about with the persons of peace. I mean, as Jesus describes, as he sends the disciples out and says, "You're going to go, and where you're welcome, stay there. Don't go to another place. Eat the food that they present you." He assumed that I'm going to provide for you through the person of peace, as the person of peace becomes the person who's going to help become an influencer in a particular people group that they have. So you're right. It's a very relational. It's not as if we come in. In fact, that's always shocked me. I remember as a young Christian reading where Jesus says there, "Don't take any bag, no extra tunic, don't take anything extra with you." It was almost as if Jesus was saying to us as disciple makers, "I want you to go out the first time realizing how much you can depend on me. That don't try and one of the things that happens in our own churches, I think in the West, is that people feel like, I will make disciples, but I've also got to make my own life for myself. They separate the two out. Like, well, I'm busy making a life, right? I'm busy earning a living. I'm busy I don't have time yet to go out and make disciples. And yet Jesus doesn't want those things to be separated. He actually integrates them together, saying, I'll take care of your needs. In fact, while you're making disciples, I'm going to take care of your needs as you're doing it. And it's just a beautiful way that he links it together, that somehow we've separated it out, which I'm not sure why we've done that. Maybe just to avoid it. Well,
oh my gosh, you just had a great layup for a story I got to share.
Wow. This is awesome. I am so glad that you're here with Barbara Lucas and I. Pastor Barbara has been doing a wonderful job as we talk through casting vision. But we're out of time for today. Hopefully you'll come back next week and hear about Barbara's story about looking for a bread mentor. It is an amazing story and just goes to show how God can use even the most simple things to really help us to be disciple makers in the world. So thank you so much for joining us here on Guerrilla Discipleship. We'll see you next week.